We are working through membership, and mostly what we're doing in membership, I don't know if you realize this, but it's really just disclosure. Let me give you an example to illustrate what I mean. If you've ever seen or been on a really big river, like the Columbia River, okay, massive river out in Washington State, Oregon area. It looks like the river, it's 1,000 yards wide in places, huge. It looks like the river runs relatively straight. But what happens if you're actually on it in a boat or something, it moves you all over the place, left, right, and you're like, what's going on? Because the surface looks like the whole river goes like this. And the answer is there's something under the surface. There's rocks, or there's channels, or there's canyons. Okay? In other words, there are these deep structures that actually shape how the current flows. The same thing is true for church. Membership is primarily about disclosing deep structures of a church that inevitably shape where the community goes so that you're not surprised when you go there. Okay? Now, so far in membership, we've talked about friendship, we've talked about Jesus, and last week we talked about sin. Okay? And one of the things I want to say, just kind of picking up with that idea of sin, most people actually start with a view of humanity as basically positive. People are basically good. So, scale of 9 to 10, that's humanity. And then they view sin as subtractive. I do the bad bits, and that kind of works against the goodness. And what that means is they think if I just chip away at the bad bits, I will end up at a net positive. All right? If you can just reduce the bad bits, you'll be back to a net positive. But the Bible has a very different view of humanity. In other words, the Bible says you don't just need to stop sinning, you need to actively start doing something else. And the something else that you need to be actively doing and pursuing is this thing called shalom. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Shalom actually starts to help address some of the brokenness of the sin. Sin, we fight against it. Shalom, we work for what the world is meant to be and what we're meant to be. And the Bible says you actually need both of those things. You need to fight against sin, but you need to work for shalom. So how we understand and define shalom, really, really significant. This passage is quintessential bedrock for the concept of shalom. So here's our outline for today. I don't have any handouts. 3 points. Number one, what it is. I just want to go, what's the story of the passage? Number two, where do you find it? And what I mean here is kind of like dinosaur bones. This passage says that if you pursue shalom, something's going to happen. And I want to know, do we see any evidence of that in the historical record anywhere? So what it is, where you find it. Third, how do you get it? 3 guardrails in the trajectory. Okay, so what it is, where you find it, how you get it. Here we go. All right, that was a nice little ding, whoever did that. Ding. Okay, let's talk about what it is. What is shalom? To answer that question, I need to do 2 things. I need to give you a definition, first of all, of just the concept. But then I want to unpack the passage here so that you can actually see that concept in the context of what Jeremiah is saying. In other words, what Jeremiah is actually saying about shalom takes the concept, but it moves it in a really interesting, challenging direction. Okay? So let's talk about the concept. This is the first subpoint. The Hebrew word for shalom is what? What's the Hebrew word for shalom? Shalom! Okay, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I'm seeing who's paying attention. Listen, part of the reason we use the word shalom is it's not easily translatable. Okay? It can be used, and it's got a really broad semantic range. So it can be used as simply as like a greeting. When you see somebody, you're like, shalom, peace. okay? Kind of like peace out kind of thing. It can be used very, very casually. But it actually has a much deeper, bigger, richer meaning. And so you will see some passage or some Bible translations translate this as peace. The ESV translates it as welfare. But look at what it says in verse 7. Seek the welfare of the city. That's seek the shalom of the city, where I have sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its shalom you will find your shalom. Do you hear what he's saying there? He's saying, seek shalom of the city, because your experience of shalom is actually going to be tied to that city's experience of shalom. All right? Jump down to verse 11. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for shalom. This verse gets preached sometimes about how like God has a wonderful plan for your life, and he does. But this verse is not primarily how your individual life is going to have an individual happy ending. It's actually about a community of people, how they are going to flourish and find their fulfillment. And God's saying, I have a plan for it. I have a plan, okay, for you. Plans for shalom, not for evil. Do you see how shalom's being contrasted with evil there? Okay. To give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. Now listen, there's one other thing. Look down at verse 14. I will be found by you, declares the Lord. I will restore your fortunes. It's not using the word shalom there, but that's the concept. Shalom means restoring the fortunes. And maybe a good word, if you want to, you could say peace, you could say welfare. I like the word flourish. In other words, what's actually envisioned here is flourishing. It's not just peace, it's not just prosperity. Okay, it's flourishing in every aspect of life. So is there an absence of conflict? Sure. Okay. Do you have enough money to pay the bills? Of course. But think about this. You could have an absence of conflict and a lot of money and not have flourishing. There's plenty of rich people that are in exactly that boat. Okay, so what the concept is getting at here, imagine this. What if every single relationship that you were in your life was actually flourishing, prospering, and thriving? So think about this. Relationships with others. What if every single relationship with another person was actually like the best it could possibly ever be? That'd be pretty amazing. What about your relationship with your job? Actually enjoying the work, finding fulfillment in your work. It actually works like it's supposed to work. Okay? The team's great. It's thriving. Not having anxiety about your work. What about your relationship with yourself? Being mentally balanced, not being exhausted, not being drained. Okay, actually feeling well. Being in physical shape, but being like in emotional shape. What about relationship with the planet and with creation? Imagine if we were actually caring for our environment like it was a garden. You ever seen gardens? They get better. They get greener. They get more fertile. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. Your relationship with God. Imagine him actually feeling close and near to him, where you feel like you actually know him. He says in the Bible, I will be your God, you will be my people. He says in this passage, verse 12, you're going to pray and I'm going to hear. All right? He says, you're going to seek me, this is in verse 13, I will be found. Do you see all those, everything I'm touching on here? Your relationship with others, your relationship with self, your relationship with creation, your relationship with God, your relationship with your work. All of those things, shalom is the idea that they are all running at their optimal level. Okay? So, flourishing, every aspect. That's the concept of shalom. Concept. Now let's talk about the context here. Okay, Jeremiah takes this concept, which Jews would have understood, okay, but he's going to unpack it in a weird and interesting way that they would have found very confusing. So what I want to do in this part, the context, I want to just give you 10 words. These aren't even bullet points, really. But if you have a Bible that's yours and you want to underline in it, these are words that I would underline in the passage. Okay? And it's just going to help you remember kind of what these key concepts are. So the first word is exile. You see it there in verse 1. Okay? All the people taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. If you know your Old Testament story, okay, the Old Testament story really kind of starts in earnest with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, right? That's going to be about 2000 BC. And then the next big jump in the narrative is to Moses when everybody comes out of Egypt. And that's about roughly, let's call it 1500 BC. And then the next big jump in the narrative, can anybody guess? So when you get David, who's a king, and that's about 1000 BC. Okay, and Israel, for a little tiny window, looks amazing. They've got a king, they're in the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, everything seems to be going well. And then you have a period of about 400 years of the kings who come after David. And if you ever want to read a depressing book, read like 1st and 2nd Kings. And it just keeps saying over and over and over again, this king did not follow the Lord. What'd you say, Marilyn? They did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And there's a handful of exceptions, but the overarching narrative is a downward spiral. When you get to this point, they are at the tail end of the story. You can actually go and read this if you want to later on your own. Second Kings chapter 24. It's right before the very end of Israel. So it's about 600 AD, BC. And Jeconiah is like the second to last king. Basically, Israel has been attacked. Do you remember how God sent Jonah to the Assyrians? We talked about that a couple of months ago. Blake talked about that. They were really bad dudes. Well, the people that are taking Israel captive now are the Babylonians. They're the ones who replaced the Assyrians. They're even badder dudes. Okay? So about 600 BC, almost everyone is gone from Jerusalem. Okay, 586 is the last straw where the city is finally destroyed. The people that are not killed are taken away, and where they go to exile is to the city of Babylon. Okay? So that's the first point, exile. You've got Jeremiah who's still left in Jerusalem. It hasn't quite fallen, but it is on its last legs. And he's writing a letter to all of the exiles who are already in the city of Babylon. And this is what that letter is going to say. What they're hoping for is like, okay, when do we get to go back? And he goes, you don't. Not yet. Not for a long time. Okay, so the first thing's exile. Let's talk about the exiles. All right. Who are the people actually taken? If you look in this passage, you're going to see that it's the ruling class. It's the priests, the prophets, the royalty. Anybody that had a skill or had value in the culture, those were the people they didn't kill, they took back to Babylon. Everybody else either got killed or they got left. If you read 1 Kings 24, it says they were only the poor, like destitute poor, were left in the land. So essentially they strip Israel of all of the ruling class. Okay, so priests, prophets, royalty. But you also see in verse 2, officials, craftsmen, metal workers. These are artisans. That's going to be important. We're going to come back to that in just a second. Okay, let me ask you a question. Who are the exiles? Are they the bad guys or are they the good guys? And the answer is, it's actually a mixed bag. Now let me tell you what I mean by that. Before the exile, you have prophets warning that if people don't turn to God, okay, turn back to God, he's going to send them into exile. So you would think that the people who get sent into exile are all the bad guys, right? Okay, and certainly like King Jeconiah, if you go read 1 Kings or 2 Kings, you're going to be like, he's a bad guy. Like, he's not a good dude. He doesn't follow God. Okay? However, who else gets sent to Babylon? Does anybody know? Famous story about a guy with some lions. Daniel and the boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, also get sent to... Yeah, Daniel and the boys. You don't know Daniel and the boys? Daniel and the boys. Come on. Read your Bible. Okay. Daniel and the boys get sent to Babylon, and you actually find out they really love God.
Yeah, they won't bow down.
So much they won't bow down. Yeah, exactly. Okay. But listen. So in other words, you have a mixture of people sent. But Daniel and the guys are actually part of the aristocracy. In other words, they have family, or they're connected to a royal family. That's part of the reason they got taken off. They're educated. Okay? One of the things you find, if a few chapters prior to this, in Jeremiah 24, Jeremiah actually uses an analogy, and he says, I'm going to tell you, he sees a vision of the good figs and the bad figs. All right? And what he says is, you might think the bad figs are going to get sent to Babylon, but I'm actually going to treat the good, I'm going to treat the people that go to Babylon, go to exile, I'm actually going to treat them as good figs. He's not saying that they're good people. What he's saying is, from this point forward, the story of God's people, the story of redemption, flows through Babylon, not through Jerusalem. Does that make sense? He's changing the narrative, and he's going, hey guys, the next field of action, the next theater where this plays out, it's actually going to depend on how you handle exile as opposed to the promised land. And we're going to find that's the place where good figs, good fruit is going to come. It's actually in the land of your sojourn, the land of your exile. Okay, so you've got exile, you've got the exiles, they're a mixed bag, but that's the future. You've got craftsmen, this is the third point, or third underline, this is in verse 2. People with skill. These are the ones who are running the country, building things, doing it well or beautifully. You see metal workers. Okay, now look down in verse 5 and 6. I'm going to give you 3 words. They build houses, they plant gardens, they take wives. That's what he's telling them to do. I want you, who are in Babylon, to do these 3 things. Build houses, plant gardens, take wives. That's garden language. That's vocation language, what you do for a job. That's multiplication language. These are culture-creating activities. This is civilization language, and it involves all of life. It's not just spiritual and religious. In other words, he doesn't say, I want you to build little shrines, or I want you to build little temples. He said, I want you to put down roots. I want you to build houses. I want you to start growing your families. I want you to practice your skills and your trades. Very much related to the kind of work that you do. Super important to see that. Now look down to the famous verse in verse 7. Seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile. Seek the shalom of the city where I've sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare, its shalom, you will find your shalom. We've already talked about flourishing, how you're supposed to seek that. I just want to say this real quick. Everybody seeks shalom. Every single person you know, even non-Christians, they are seeking their flourishing, right? Why do people put so much effort into their careers? They want to flourish. Why do people put so much hope in romantic relationships? They think that will help with flourishing. Why do people put so much hope into like nonprofits or politics? Or like every single person that's doing something is seeking flourishing, but almost every single person on the face of the planet who's flourishing, whose shalom are they seeking? Theirs. And what he's actually saying here is, I want you to seek the shalom of the city where I have sent you. What's the city? It's Babylon. It's the pagan city. It's the enemy city. It's the city that is just raped, pillaged, and plundered. This would have been shocking. Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying your shalom is going to be tied up to your ability to actually stop worrying about your shalom and seek the shalom of the others who have actually oppressed you, the enemies and the foes. And he goes, if you can start to actually seek your enemies' flourishing, pray to the Lord for them, guess what you'll find? Your own shalom. But if you seek your own shalom, guess what you're going to lose? You're going to lose your shalom. It actually sounds a lot like what Jesus says in the New Testament, where he says, if you seek to save your life, you're going to lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake and the sake of the gospel, you'll find it. It's the same kind of thing here. Okay. The 8th word, 70 years. This is down in verse 10. How long was the average lifespan?
35.
Probably 35, 40. Okay. So if you were an old timer, you might make it to 70 or 80, but that's the exception. So when he says you're going to be there at least 70 years, what is that? Death sentence. In other words, this isn't just like a stint in county jail. This is like being exiled. Like if you're in Russia and you get sent to like one of the work camps, you're probably not coming back. Okay? This is a death sentence. In other words, I'm sending you to this place, and I want you to seek shalom all the way to your death. Can you imagine how hard that would, like, if you were God's people, that would be really, really difficult to hear, to swallow. Are you serious? After what these people have just done to us? You've got to be kidding me. And he says, no, do it. The 9th word is plans. Down in verse 11. He's saying God is in this. God has a purpose. The purpose is to help you experience shalom, to actually get it, to bring you back, to return. So the plan of this is actually to get you back to the promised land, but in the right state of mind, the right attitude of your heart. And that's the last word to underline is heart down in verse 13. He says, I want you to call, I want you to seek, I want you to find, right? You will call, you will seek, you will find when it happens with all your heart. That's one of the keys. God is looking for a particular kind of heart. It's one of the things we should all ask ourselves. If God feels distant, how much is my heart really seeking and wanting to find Him? We'll come back to that in a second. Do you see the basic context of this passage now? You've got this big loaded concept called shalom, which is flourishing. And God says, I want you all to lay down your lives in this place that is not your home. And you're going to have families and raise kids. And most of them are probably thinking, I'm not having kids here. Are you kidding? In this place? I wouldn't want to bring my... And he's like, no, do it. Start jobs, build houses, plant gardens, cultivate. But what I really want you to do is not for your shalom. I want you to do it for the city's shalom. And he says, if you do this, you will actually experience my shalom that I have planned for you. That's what's going on in this passage. Okay. You good so far? Now we're going to go quicker. All right. Where do you actually find this kind of enemy-serving shalom anywhere in history? This is why I said dinosaur bones earlier. Like, can we actually look at the historical record and find any evidence that something like this actually happened? God says, my people, the good figs, are going to go into exile, use their exile as an opportunity to seek the shalom of the city of their foes where God has sent them. So do we have any evidence that that happened? Historical evidence, hard evidence. And the short answer is no. Not in Babylon. In other words, we don't have any historical evidence that the Jews who went to Babylon actually did what this verse said. Now, we do know that the Jews flourished in Babylon, but they flourished in their little communities. In fact, when they actually had the chance to go back to Israel, a lot of them stayed. We know that Babylon became a cultural hub for Jews. So the Jews actually did okay in Babylon. But we have no evidence that they actually sought the welfare like he's talking about here. You could argue Daniel maybe, okay? But we don't have any broad historical evidence that the Jews actually, they put up with their enemies. They didn't seek to benefit their enemies. At least if they did, we don't have any evidence of it. Okay. Can you think of this ever happening anywhere else in history? And the answer is yes. Do you know where it is? First 3 centuries of Christianity. Let me give you some examples. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. You ever heard that before? Who says it? Jesus. Do you hear that shalomic language for your enemies? Okay. He says in the same passage, Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, you're the salt of the earth, you're the city on the hill. Salt was a preservative. He's actually calling his people to be a preservative in society and a light. And for all of society, not just their little tribe. Okay? Acts 2:42, the early church devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayers. And what else did they do right after that? Anybody who had needs among them, they met them. They were selling their possessions to take care of each other. Do you see the shalomic? In other words, working for each other's shalom. Ephesians 4:28, Paul says, let the thief no longer steal, rather let him labor, let him learn how to do honest work with his hands, that he might have something to share with anyone in need. Do you hear that? He's saying the purpose of your work is so that you can actually create excess, more than what you need, not so you can hoard it for your retirement. It's so that you can actually be a blessing to anyone who is in need around you. That's shalom, okay? Listen, shalom language is all over the New Testament. We've talked about this before, so I'm not going to belabor it. You can search for the places where the New Testament talks about good deeds and good works. And I would argue that is what that's like shorthand in New Testament, which is in Greek, not in Hebrew, where it's really about like that idea of pursuing the good. It's like public good, public service. It's shalom. Okay? All over the first 3 centuries of Christianity. Listen to this. So if you've been around here, you've heard this before. AD 251, Cornelius, who's a bishop in Rome, mentions to the Fabian, I think it is, who's a bishop in Antioch. They're exchanging letters. And he says, we've got 46 priests, we have 7 deacons, we have 7 subdeacons, we have 42 acolytes. They had actually divided Rome into 7 regions. They've got a deacon with a subdeacon and 6 deacon helpers doing massive amounts of mercy in Rome. Listen to this. He's like, we have 1,500 widows on our rolls. He's not bragging. He's just mentioning it. Okay? This is before the basilicas. There is no St. Paul's Cathedral yet because Christianity is still illegal. So where are they meeting? They're meeting underground still. And the church in Rome has this many people on staff taking care of this many folks. Early estimates say that the church in Rome was spending between 500,000 and 1 million sesterces, which just translated loosely, dollars, a year just on mercy. The underground church. Do you hear that? That was so significant that the pagans took notice. In AD 251, literally the same year that Cornelius is writing this, the plague hits. It's the second major plague, Black Death. At the peak, you can read about this in Rodney Stark's Rise of Christianity. Highly recommend this book. Rodney Stark is not a Christian when he's writing this book. And he's going like, why did so many people convert? I want to really think about that. It's not because Constantine became emperor and said everybody convert. He argues Constantine became emperor or became a Christian because everybody was converting. And he goes, why was everybody converting? And the answer was, he goes through and he looks at his history. He's a sociologist and he's a historian. And he says, guess what? When the plagues hit Rome, at the peak, this is AD 250, when the church is like firing on all cylinders for widows and stuff like that, at its peak, 5,000 people were dying per day in Rome. And do you know what everybody did? Bailed. Everybody sought their own shalom. Get the heck out of Rome. They moved to the countryside. Doctors moved to the countryside. Rich people moved to the countryside. Politicians moved to the countryside. Anybody that had means got out, except for the Christians. The Christians moved in, took care of people, and many of them died. And the pagans said, we've never seen anything like this. These guys aren't afraid of death. They're giving up their shalom to care for all the... And then you wonder why non-Christians converted. They were like, I want in on this. Okay? There's another example. AD 63, the Emperor Julian, who was a pagan. He's trying to revive pagan. He loved paganism. But he's writing a letter to another pagan, and he's like complaining about pagans. He's like, our people do a lousy job of caring for other people because they're all so self-focused. And he says, everybody knows the Jews take care of their own people. He's like, you never see a Jew begging. And he goes, but the Christians, and he calls them the impious Galilean. He's like, the damn Christians. The damn Christians are even worse. Because not only do they care for their own poor, they care for our poor also. And he's going, it's putting us to shame. It's making us pagans look bad. We need to be more like the Christians. And here's my point. We actually have a historical record that what Jeremiah 29 talks about, it actually happened in history, and you can find hard evidence, and I don't have any hard evidence of any other, this is the significant evidence, 300 years of the early church, okay, where it happened. Now listen, it's rare. It happens here and there in little bits and spurts, but it has happened, and this is where we should all ask ourselves just a question. Does my faith move me like this? Does my faith move me sacrificially in the direction of people I don't like to actually seek their shalom, being willing to give up my own shalom? Why doesn't my faith move me more? Okay, what's the fossil record of my life? What's the reason why this is probably rare in my life? How much do I want this? Okay? What do I have to do to get it? And that moves us to the third point. So here, follow our outline. What it is. We talked about the passage. 2, where do you find it? We've actually got a window in history. 3, how do you get it? And what I want to do is give you 3 quick guardrails and then a trajectory. Is everybody tracking? I can do this in 10 minutes. Okay. Yeah, question.
You're saying, do I want this? Are you talking about that sacrificial life?
Yeah, do I actually, listen, here's what I want to say is, when you look at people that live this way and actually were sacrificial, they were doing this shalom thing, is that something that we actually want?
Well, I guess my question is, are we supposed to want the seeking of shalom, or are we supposed to want the reason for it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, hold that thought, because I think we're going to get there.
What question did he ask?
He asked, say it again, Malachi.
Are we supposed to want the outcome in our lives of wanting to seek shalom? Do I just want myself to suddenly, do I want my value system to suddenly be about caring for other people?
So we're going to get at the motivation. I think the answer is you have to want both. In other words, if somebody is saying, I'm just going to really focus on like what the motivation behind shalom and not really worry about, like what I'm getting at is the first thing you have to do is to go, do I actually want that kind of sacrificial lifestyle? If that's what it takes to know and experience shalom, to pour myself out for shalom in the lives of others, do I want that? And if not, I need to actually have an honest conversation with myself. Why don't I want that? But once I do want it, then we're going to talk about motivation, because if you don't have, you could pursue that till you're blue in the face, but without the right motivation, you won't get it. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Okay. How do you get it? Great segue and transition. 3 guardrails and then a trajectory. Here's the first guardrail that I want to throw out there. Do you see in verse 7, he says, seek the welfare of the city. All right? What's our city? Austin. Okay. Don't think that way.
Is the world.
Don't think bigger. Think the other direction. Think smaller. Because here's what happens. It's tempting to go, Austin, world-class city. Let's actually think, I'm a citizen of the world. When you get bigger, it becomes abstract. None of us our cities are bigger now than they were back then. Now, Rome was big.
Where you are.
What'd you say?
Wherever you are, right?
Yeah. Think of your neighborhood. Okay? And this is what I want to do is I want to actually take that word city and I want to localize it a little bit. When you read city, just substitute in my neighborhood is like a small city. City is too big and you won't get practical and concrete. So think in terms of your neighborhood. If you crush it in your neighborhood, seeking shalom, you have my permission to add a second neighborhood and then a third. And if you can crush it in all those neighborhoods, then you can start thinking about the city. I still use the city language, but what I've realized is it's a mistake to focus on, like, I'm not trying to reach all of Austin. I'm trying to make a difference in the neighborhood that I'm planted, East Austin. Okay, and then in the second neighborhood, which is really close to here, Hyde Park, where we have the second Lazarus. In other words, focus on your neighborhood. It's okay to think about your web of relationships, because we live in a culture where our neighborhoods actually extend across other neighborhoods in terms of the people we connect with. But it's really sure to focus, make sure that whatever you're thinking about with your neighborhood, like if it includes your work relationships, the people you know, stuff like that, make sure it includes your neighbors and proximity, not just friends that you hand selected. In other words, your neighborhood is not just the circle of friends that you like to hang out with because they're cool and they do all the things you like to do. Neighbors actually involve the people that live next to you that you're like, why do they live next to? Okay, those are the people that we need to actually think about, what does it look like to serve? Okay? And what that does is that localizes you. I'm just saying, when you hear city, think neighborhood, try to be really local. Second thing, enemies and foes. It is very easy for city and shalom to sound sexy. Like it's popular to move to cities. Okay? New York City, Olivia, you were there. Everybody's like moving there. This whole idea of love the city, it sells in New York. People are like, yeah, really what they're doing is enjoying the city. Okay? They are mining the city for all that it has to. And my point is, what keeps this grounded in reality is who this loving the city is actually intended for. It's intended for your foes and for your enemies, people that you don't like. Okay, so this is not just a big idea. What this does, the whole idea of enemies evaporates romanticism. Shalom is hard. Shalom is costly. Shalom is messy. Okay? And you need to pursue it for people that you don't necessarily like. And what that does, that humanizes you. So neighborhood localizes you. Enemies and foes and people that you don't really like humanizes you, humanizes them. The third thing, remember what I said about sin. This is last week. If the essence of sin is not your bad behavior, but it's actually crafting a version of yourself that says, here's what makes me okay, and you put something in the blank, right? That blank might be religion, it might be moral goodness, or it might be money, wealth, comfort, friends. But the point is, whatever you put in the blank, okay, is the thing you're trusting in. All right? And once you dive into the Bible's idea of sin, this idea of trusting in something that I'm filling in the blank, you start realizing, my goodness, I'm really self-focused. So it'd be really easy to latch on to shalom as a new, better, shiny version. I'm going to be others focused now. Look how much I'm no longer doing these other things. And what I'm really doing is just building a whole new identity about how well I'm seeking shalom. And the point is, if you do that, you're really doing it for the sake of shalom and for the sake of your own, you've fallen right back into the same trap. Okay? So what happens is, when you remember what the Bible teaches about sin, that reorients you. So the neighborhood peace localizes you, the enemy's peace humanizes you, and our understanding of sin reorients us and protects us from kind of just making another identity out of seeking shalom. There are lots of people who work in nonprofits that are building identities about how they're going to seek the shalom of the world. They don't use that language, but that's what they're doing. So how do you actually seek shalom without just making that an identity? And the answer is your motivation. And here's just what I want to point out. I'm going to say this very quickly. God says, I want you to seek the shalom of others in the city, verse 7. But he also says, I want you to seek me, down in verse 13. Do you see that? It says, seek the shalom of the city. But down in verse 13, seek me. So what we're really seeking as we seek the shalom of the city, are we seeking shalom, or are we really seeking God? Okay? Listen, do you remember what God told Jonah about the Assyrians? Right at the very end, he said, should I not have pity on this great city? And really, his beef with Jonah is that Jonah doesn't give a rat's ass about the Assyrians. He doesn't have any compassion for them. So God is saying to Jonah, I want you to have compassion for your enemies. But here he's going even further and saying, I don't want you to have sympathy. I don't just want you to have sympathy. I don't just want you to have empathy and compassion. I actually want you to work for their good. And I want you to do that because that's the kind of God I am. Have we ever seen God himself do this? And the answer is yes. His son Jesus comes down and has compassion on the city of man. He gives up his shalom to make peace. By his stripes we are healed. When we actually start to desire God, and this is the key in there, when we call on him, when we pray to him, when we seek him and find him, when you seek me with all your heart, what's the greatest commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. When we come back to that and go, I want to know God, even if that means that I have to love my neighbor, you know what? That's exactly right. This is about loving God and loving your neighbor. And what he's saying, I think, is you will never truly be able to love your neighbor with no strings attached, okay, until you love your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we've got to keep coming back to this. But what we can't do is to say, oh, we don't have to worry about shalom for our neighbors. We actually need to confess and repent for how much we seek shalom for ourselves. And we need to recognize how much Jesus gave up his shalom so that we might have peace. All right? Let me pray for us and we'll come to the Lord's Supper.